Hey folks, today I'll be reviewing my games from the 2022 Western Class Open. So I actually ended up winning the tournament, which was quite surprising. It was just a small 5-round event down in Southern California. It was actually my second tournament win in a row because I also won the Golden State Open previously. This one I actually tied for first, but it's first time ever that I can remember where I got two first place finishes in a row. So it was pretty cool. So this was held first weekend of March, and round one here I'm playing against Elbert Zeng, and I decided to play the 2-day section. So my first two games were game in 60, just 60 minutes per side and like 10-second delay, and then the final three games were more like a longer time control, like 90 minutes for 40 moves, and then 30 minutes after that, and then the typical 30-second increment from move one. So this first game ends up being pretty tough. My opponent goes d4, and we quickly get King's Indian, and I had a little bit of time to prepare for this one, so I decided to play knight a6. Of course, black has lots of moves here. Knight d7 is also very popular, and e5 is kind of considered the main line. But I decided to play knight a6 because I noticed that he was playing in this position the move d5, and my feeling is that this is definitely not the most critical way of meeting the system, and in fact gives black, in my view, I think just like totally equal play. Instead, white has like bishop e3 and rook e1, and these moves are definitely, I think, more challenging. That said, I ended up getting in trouble very quickly out of the opening, but I did feel like this was a good line to go into, because here black just gets to immediately put the knight on c5, hitting the pawn. White has to go queen c2, and black gets an a5. And this is very nice because the knight on c5 is very strong, and now it's kind of hard for white to challenge it. And in the meantime, I want to play like knight e8 or knight h5 and something at f5 and just get the typical kingside play going. So bishop g5, h6, bishop e3, b6. This is all known. This move is needed because white had a threat after bishop e3 to take on e5 and win a pawn. So b6 defending the knight. Here white goes knight to d2, very typical move, and knight h7. So here I'm following the Gawain Jones repertoire on Chessable, where he suggests this one, and I had basically like 15-20 minutes before the game just to look at a couple of these lines, and it was very helpful, but also ends up confusing me a little bit. So in the game, white plays a3, which I think is a very logical move, right? Just trying to play for b4. I went f5, threatening to push f4, and now white takes. So had white played f3, I think this was the main thing that I was kind of looking into before the game. Then it's very important for black to play a4, which I understood during the game, just kind of the strength of this plan. But of course, this move is a pawn sacrifice. So number one, we're stopping white from pushing b4. So if they don't take on c5, it's just very hard for them to do anything productive here. So bishop takes c5 is kind of critical, and then taking the pawn on a4. But here black goes h5, the bishop comes to h6, and the black just gets fantastic compensation and just a great King's Indian type of attack. So I was definitely looking forward to playing this position. But in the game, white goes ef5, gf5, and f3. And I remember in my notes kind of looking at a kind of similar transformation where white takes on f5, we get a little bit more open position. And I remember seeing that like queen e8 was being suggested by the engine with this plan of just like playing queen g6 or bishop d7. And so I felt like, okay, this is playable. Maybe a4 is playable here too. And I ended up just going queen e8 because this was a g60. So I made this move maybe in like, I don't know, 3-4 minutes. I really didn't spend that much time on it. I'm thinking that I'm kind of following my prep. When in reality, this is actually a serious mistake because here white can go b4 immediately. And the problem is, I've made all these moves on the queen side, like a5, b6, but now when white goes b4, c5, they're just immediately creating tons and tons of contact and just achieving white's typical plan in the King's Indian, which is to just blow open the queen side and put the rooks on the C and B files and win the game positionally. So here when white gets b4, and white is already just doing extremely well. So then I checked my notes after the game, and I realized that what I was looking at earlier is in case of white first starting with b3. So b3 is another very logical move here for white because it avoids all these a4 ideas. The problem is it's just a tempo slower. Now white has to go a3 next and then b4 to achieve the same plan. Of course, this is very much worthwhile for white because this is the biggest plan in the position. So if it takes an extra tempo, so be it. But here the difference is when black plays f5, let's say white takes, and f3 is in the game. Here black doesn't have any ideas to push a4, but they can go queen e8 and bishop d7 in time to meet b4 with knight a4. And this is a pretty important difference. Then there are some tactics where if white goes knight b5, which is their kind of usual idea, black can take and go e4 and opening up the bishop against the rook, threatening e takes f3 as well. And yeah, essentially black is doing fine. So this was the point behind playing queen e8 and bishop d7, but in the game when white starts with a3, I'm just not in time because I go queen e8, my bishop's not on d7 yet, white plays b4, and I'm forced to go back with the knight. So now rook b1, queen g6, knight b5, and I wasn't sure exactly how bad things were, but I was definitely starting to really dislike my position. Now white gets in c5, and yeah, I really wasn't sure how to react to this one because my feeling was that white is already achieving so much on the queen side, and best case scenario for me, I can play like bishop f8, rook g7, create like one threat against g2, but then white plays g3 or rook f2. There's like, a million ways to defend against this. So yeah, but again, it's g60, so I don't really have a ton of time to figure it out. I just try to make the most natural moves. I take on c5. It was also possible to throw in taking on b4, but I felt like this would just open up more lines on the queen side for white to attack with, so I decided not to. So I go bc, knight takes c5, and yeah, here I was definitely expecting bishop takes, because okay, it looks very natural to ruin black structure, and white can play bishop c4 or d6 first, and then bishop c4. And my idea here was to eventually just sack the exchange and just play like bishop f8, where white can go d6, but then I take this one, they take on f7, I think queen takes, and I had some kind of position like this in mind where I have a bunch of pawns for the exchange. I had no idea if I'm holding or not, but I definitely felt like at least there's some upside here, like if the pawns start moving forward and I can kind of consolidate it, very hard for the pieces to defend against these pawns. Now the engine hates this in view of kind of a concrete thing, knight c4 here. And the point is that black is just not really in time to defend this one. Otherwise, it would be kind of a viable position for black, but I can defend like rook a6, but then rook fd1, and the position is kind of collapsing because any kind of d5, there's knight takes e5. So yeah, basically this wasn't holding, but that was kind of the idea. And also what I was more or less expecting to happen. Instead, my opponent surprised me with this move knight to b3. And it was surprising at first, but to me the move looked very strong because white doesn't give up their dark square bishop, instead just trades off the knight for my knight on c5. It's kind of a temporary pawn sacrifice because white is down a pawn, but eventually white is either breaking through on c5 or on c7 and getting their pawn back, it seems. And yeah, here I definitely went into the tank and just, I don't know, really couldn't figure out what to do. One of the first things I looked at was just taking on b3, say rook takes b3 and trying something like bishop a6, pinning the knight so that knight takes c7. Doesn't really work tactically. I can take and then take on e2. But this one I kind of like talked myself out of it because I figured, okay, white can play something like rook to c3 and the c7 pawn is eventually falling, and it didn't look great. It looked like black was maybe slightly worse. I wasn't really sure how bad something like this was, like take, but I felt like, okay, I'm probably at least somewhat worse here. So I started looking for other options after knight to b3. Eventually I ended up playing bishop f6, which is very ugly because again I'm allowing white to take on c5, and totally ruined the structure and allowing white to break through with d6. So again, white is just achieving exactly what their dream is in the King's Indian, and now the position's opening up and it feels like black is just completely busted. So obviously I analyzed the games afterwards, and it turns out actually the first instinct was not that bad, just taking on b3 and going bishop a6. The problem was, I started with this one, I didn't really love this position. I started looking for alternatives. I didn't really find anything I liked at all. Eventually I just went with some move that I thought like, okay, maybe at least I can put my rook on g7 and in play for some tricks. So really, really bad decision overall, because if you compare the lines, like the position I end up getting here after d6 takes is way, way worse than the position if you just look at this one, like with bishop a6, let's say rook c3, takes. I think the engine gives knight f6 and even says like black was equal, but it's not even the point. Even if black is like slightly worse here, it's still like a much, much better alternative than what happens. So yeah, essentially kind of like my second, let's say, real serious mistake of the game. And now I just felt like I have a losing position here. I end up going rook f8 because on rook g7, white has knight takes, or bishop c4 check and then takes on c8, followed by bishop e6, and the f5 pawn is falling. So I have to play rook f8 here, so that on bishop c4 check, I can still keep a rook on the f pawn and eventually defend that one. So check, king h8. White ends up going rook f d1 here. And sorry, I should mention the point is that if white takes on c8 and does something like this, then black would have bishop to g5. So this is kind of my one trick in the position where we're defending on f5. If takes, then bishop takes e3 with check, and then we win the second piece. So black should be doing pretty well here. And if white takes on g5, then we can take this bishop on e6. And I think black is still worse because all my pawns are weak and king is exposed, but at least we've managed not to lose the game, and we're even a pawn up. So maybe there's some upside for black in this position. So yeah, instead white just plays rook f d1, which I think is a much better move, just keeping the strong knight on d6. And yeah, white's still a pawn down, but clearly is the one that's kind of calling the shots in this position, because everything is just so open. I have zero counterplay. I've given up on my dream of putting a rook on the g file, and even if I achieved it, it would threaten very, very little. I think bishop d5 is even stronger. This is kind of a concrete thing where white hits the rook, and after, let's say, rook a7, now white can take and go bishop e6 and win the f5 pawn. So I definitely didn't see that during the game. Neither did my opponent. It seems it ends up going here. And at this point, I decide, like, I have to just start kind of burning all my bridges. So I tried e4. This was my one idea where I felt like maybe I can mix things up a little bit and make it kind of hard for white, just to try and, kind of turn things around in my favor. Now, the idea here is to kind of open some lines for my bishop and my rook as well. It does require sacrificing 2 pawns, so I'm now pawn down, but at least I felt like I can get some active play for my pieces. So bishop g4, white goes rook d2. Bishop d4 check was also possible, but then white was, of course, just going to take immediately on d4. And the point is, this is just a very nice exchange sacrifice after takes, bishop e5 check. I have to block like knight f6, and yeah, this position just looked absolutely horrible for me, just like rook f1, and all of white's pieces are extremely strong. So on rook takes d4, I could take rook takes f4, and then black is still just kind of a pawn down, and the game goes on. White is completely winning, but I decided it seemed better to first throw in bishop g4 just to develop the piece with tempo, and then I go bishop d4 check. He takes here. Once again, if I take, then bishop e5 is, I think, really, really bad for black, so I just take the dark square bishop as well. Now rook d2, knight to g5, and yeah, here I was starting to get a little optimistic, just hoping for some cheapos like knight f3 check, knight h3 check. At least I have a square for my rook, and with all my pieces lined up, I could look for some tactics against the enemy king. But he finds queen c3 check, which is very unfortunate. Queen b2 check was also good, and it turns out that my king just doesn't have a really safe square. to go to, because if I go to the 7th rank, then there's going to be rook to b7 check, and yeah, just very, very awkward for black to defend here. So I'm forced to go queen g7 and allow a queen trade. And honestly, I was happy just not to be immediately losing, but okay, now we're a pawn down in an endgame. And yeah, I definitely felt at this point that like, I've been losing the game for a while. I might just like lose the first game, which would be a bummer, but I was feeling thankful that it's a G60, which means that it won't affect my FIDE rating, which is a good thing. But yeah, it was kind of like a bummer to just be like totally lost. But I kept fighting. I felt like I had chances to kind of salvage the draw here, because it was only one extra pawn for white, and things could possibly turn around, or very easy for white to just end up losing their extra pawn, and then I would be more or less okay. But my opponent plays this phase of the game really well. He goes rook f1, just neutralizing the rooks on the f file. I played bishop e6 here. I think at this point I'm definitely approaching some real time trouble. We're probably both under well under 10 minutes actually at this point, might be like 5 minutes or less. But he goes rook f2, which I thought made a lot of sense, and actually now just forcing a trade of all the rooks, because the rook on f4 is hanging, and if I play bishop takes c4, for example, then rook takes f4, bishop takes f1, white can take on f8, and then take here, and then we're in a knight endgame where, I'm just down a very, very clean pawn, and it looked like total suffering. So I decide, well, I have to trade off one pair of rooks, rook takes f2, and then I go rook b8, because I figure, okay, if I have any chances here, I really have to keep at least one rook on the board to create counterplay. And he is able to trade off the bishops, but that's fine. Knight gets to e6. But the unfortunate thing is that white now gets rook f7 check, king g8, and to my surprise doesn't play rook f6. I really thought this was going to be the move, just hitting the knight and winning a second pawn. And then I was just going to go knight d4, rook takes h6, rook to b3, and yeah, just hope for the best. I mean, I figured white is winning here, but at least black has counterplay, can take this pawn, run the a pawn, and my king can kind of defend against all of white's passed pawn. So as long as the e pawn doesn't somehow run through, then I thought, okay, at least black has some chances. But the position is winning for white. In fact, I think one of the most instructive ways of winning is this move rook h3, which I definitely was not thinking about during the game, but I just think it's quite a nice idea, because the point is white forces a rook trade and is willing to give up, the two healthy connected passed pawns to now just having doubled h pawns, and white has to be okay with losing the e5 pawn. But this endgame turns out to be winning for white, because the h-pawns are very strong, and the fact that there's two of them is a good thing. And also white's king is just coming in very quickly to the queen side. So this is kind of a classic, outside pass pawn endgame with knights on the board. But yeah, essentially black isn't able to hold here. So white ends up actually playing rook to b7, which I felt like was maybe a sign that is kind of not really sure about the technique and just trying to limit the counterplay. So rook f8, and so I'm happy now to be down just one pawn instead of two. And yeah, somewhere around here we were both like well under 5 minutes, and we essentially stopped recording moves because it was only a 10-second delay, and that's just not enough time. I think on 30-second increment you're required to record moves, but if it's not 30-second increment, once you're under 5 minutes you're allowed to stop. And we basically just kind of blitzed the rest of the game out. I think we had like 1 or 2 minutes each at this point with the 10-second delay. And I'm not sure I have the moves 100% accurately here after the game. I just kind of input it from memory, but I have a rough idea of what happened. I played knight f4, threatening to checkmate in 2 with knight e2, rook f1. White went g3, I went back knight e6. White does end up winning the second pawn here, but at least black gets to activate the rook. And yeah, we end up repeating moves a couple times, rook e7, rook c7. This may have happened more than once, like rook a7 here, but eventually we get like knight d4, a4. I brought my rook back this way. a5, I played rook a2. And at this point, the only thing I'm playing for is just this typical drawing mechanism of like rook to d2 and knight f3 check. So for example, a6, I think I would go rook d2 here, and let's say knight e4, some random move. I go knight f3 check, take this one, and yeah, black has a draw by perpetual because of course the king can never go into the corner. So instead, white ends up going knight c4, I think trying to stop this idea. And yeah, we're both on, at this point, I think it's like, we both have like 10 or 20 seconds with a 10-second delay. So rook c2, I'm just like attacking the knight, rook e2, white gives this check, I come up, h4, king h5. Now it looks like g4, the king might be getting mated, but it turns out I'm actually fine and the king is escaping via g3, and actually feels like white is the one that might be getting checkmated here. So he ends up going knight f1, which I think is probably the losing blunder, because this allows knight f3 check, king h1. And at first I think I was going to play king to g4, because my idea was to like just to come in and try to checkmate. But then I realized, no, rook f2, this is the move, just hitting the knight. The knight is of course frozen because it has to defend the h2 square, and I'm threatening to just take and win the piece. Although I realize that's not so clear, because once I take king g2, my rook is under attack, my knight is under attack, it might be hard to hold on to everything. So white goes rook f6, and now it would be actually a huge mistake to take, because then king g2, and white is just winning the piece back and is going to have 2 extra pawns and winning endgame. But instead I have king to g4, and I realize, you know, I can just literally walk my king in and white's pieces are totally paralyzed. So that's what ends up happening. Rook g6 check. Okay, kind of last mistake. I think white has to like sack the exchange and try to somehow survive by like giving up the pawns to distract the king and the rook. But essentially, if black is careful, they can pretty much pick up everything and solely win. But instead rook g6 happened, king h3, and here white resigned because now he's literally just getting mated next move. So yeah, what can I say? Definitely a lucky win here. I felt somewhere around this moment, you know, that my opponent was starting to really panic. Up until this point, I thought, you know, he played really well and fully deserved the win. But okay, you know, when you're down to like under a minute, and yeah, the game is in this like very high stress, high pressure environment, you're playing against like high rated player and you're winning the game, yeah, it's easy to kind of like lose your cool. And yeah, I definitely kind of felt, you know, like his brain shutting off, while I was able to maintain some composure, like still like calculating a little bit, trying to figure out, okay, where do I need to put my rook, put my knight, you know, finding a plan for my king. Whereas at a certain point, I think white just kind of started playing like the first moves he could find, like knight f1 here, totally unnecessary, and ends up getting himself mated. So yeah, kind of a lucky win in the time trouble. I was definitely feeling like I didn't deserve the win, but I was of course ready to take it and move on to the next round.